Hi there, I'm Christy. In this video, I am going to troubleshoot some tomato growing issues that a lot of people have at the seedling stage of growing tomatoes. And I thought while I'm potting these up and sharing with you what I'm noticing is going on with these tomatoes and how to fix it, I thought I would also share some insight of why you would want to grow tomatoes and some information about tomato growing that if you're a beginner or intermediate tomato gardener, you might find some of this information very helpful. So I hope you stick around and learn some new information about growing tomatoes and gardening. So we're doing a tomato update on the seedlings that I started back on March the 3rd. As a recap, if you haven't seen my other videos about seeds starting this year, I am growing a bunch of different varieties. One of the varieties is called Beaver Lodge tomato. It's a slicer tomato. I'm trying a Tennessee yellow cherry tomato, early girl tomato, and indigo rose tomato. Now, this is what's interesting. Okay, so I had some germination issues with the yellow cherry tomato. Now these were the Tennessee yellow cherry tomato. They were a gift like a free gift, and I knew the germination was low. It said, but I do have two. I have one that germinated right at the beginning and one that took its sweet time. It's just popping up now. But look at the size difference. These are a determinant variety, meaning they are going to be like needing staking, but they're not going to be vining where they're going to continuously grow. They're going to get to a certain size and then that's about it. These are all indeterminate, meaning they're just going to grow and grow and grow until they freeze. They're just going to keep going. What's interesting is that the indigo rose, they actually look very nice. There's not really a lot of issues with it, but the early girl tomatoes are not doing very well. Every single one of them is yellowing. Every single one of them is stressed right out. And I really had a lot of issues with phosphorus, especially, well, these guys, the phosphorus deficiency, the purpling on the leaves. I really had an issue with the indigo rose ones. Now, I don't know if that's typical for this type of tomato because I've never grown this variety before, but I am noticing some yellowing, a little bit of yellowing and a lot of purpling on the leaves. And that usually means phosphorus deficiency. However, troubleshooting this a little bit, I think it's just stress. So they could be because they're competing for light and they are getting a little bit leggy. Or maybe I fertilized them too much because I did feed them 20-20-20 fertilizer at half strength. But there's something going on. They don't like it. I do need to get them out of here for sure. But the Beaver Lodge tomatoes, even though I didn't have quite the good germination, the plants are better. They're bigger, they're healthier, they're just darting up. There's a few that got squished over when I was arranging plants. I had moved them. They got trapped over when I was moving plants on the grow light shelf, but they look fairly decent. There's a little bit of purpling still left. The purpling is actually, it's reducing. It's being fixed up. So I do think they're too wet. And so I do need to pot them up today, which is my intention. But I just wanted to kind of show that difference. The Beaver Lodge tomatoes are definitely outperforming in growth and staying quite hardy. Like they're not as much like they're not in as much distress as some of these other varieties are. They're a little more flimsy, leggy kind of thing, but these guys are just not putting on any growth. They're just starting to drop leaves, and I think it's very strange because they've all been watered the same and under the same light. So just something to consider. This here cherry tomato, this one here, it is the Tennessee yellow. Aside from the germination issue, it looks pretty comparable to the Beaver Lodge variety, whereas the indigo girl or the indigo rose, it actually was late coming up. It took a little bit longer to germinate, but once it did, it's just exploding in growth. So basically, the one that I see, the underdog right now, it is basically the early girl. It's just, there's something up with it and it's not happy. So let's remedy that today. The habaneros are definitely looking a little bit better today. So I'm gonna get these all potted up. These guys here potted up so the habaneros can have a little bit more light, and maybe I'll just cut this strip out and pop it in so we're getting more space efficient with our seedlings. So that's what I'll do. So I'm going to pot up these tomato plants, the early girls, the ones that are really stressed out, and I'm going to give them a little bit of bone meal in the cup. And I'm just using potting mix, like regular potting mix, and then I will feed them with a half strength fertilizer wet, like after they're planted and such. And I'm going to see if that helps them. I don't know why they're turning yellow, so maybe I'll just do part of them that way and see what the results are in a few days. We'll go from there. So the bone meal that I'm using is 4-10-0, which is pretty standard. So 4 is the nitrogen, 10 is the phosphorus, and 0 is the potassium. So I think we'll give this a shot and see what happens. Usually when tomatoes turn purple or they have yellowing, a lot of the times it's a deficiency in the P, the number 10 number here. That's what I've learned in the past. That's what I've troubleshooted before, and so that's what I'm treating for, and just gonna see if this is gonna make a very big difference. So there's not a lot in the cups. It's very, very little in there, just a little sprinkle. It's just enough to get them a boost. So I'm gonna split and divide. Now remember what I said in the previous videos about how it doesn't matter if you break the root systems. These little fuzzies that you can see right there, those are all going to grow roots. These are all wanting to become roots. So you should be gentle with them because you don't want to shock them. But I find with tomatoes, I've had just as good of tomato crops when I broke the roots right off of the plant. So definitely want to be gentle. And you see me I just pop that one little leaf off, and then I'm just gonna get the soil up as much as I can to kind of get it nice and secure in there, tucked in snug as a bug. So you'll probably notice I just took off all of the baby leaves that were turning purple and yellow. So, you know, it's probably very common too that tomatoes, they will shed their baby leaves as well. Some varieties do, some don't. They'll be fine. They will be fine. So there's a few things a person should know if you're new to growing tomatoes. Things that I kind of learned the hard way when I was starting out. So if you're new to gardening, new to starting these type of things at your home or homestead or backyard or wherever you're growing, it's good to know these things. So tomatoes, they come in a couple different varieties, and I'm just going to keep planting as I'm talking. But tomatoes come in a couple different varieties, not just like cherry or paste or beefsteak or those kind. There's other types of tomatoes that you kind of need to know what you're growing. And the reason for that is because some have different requirements. An example, like the ones that I'm growing a indeterminate and determinate variety. So what indeterminate means is that it's indeterminate of how big it's going to be. That it's just going to grow and grow and grow and just keep growing. And the more space it has and the more heat it has, the more ideal conditions it has, it'll just grow until it can't grow anymore. A frost will take it out, or something will stop it from growing. Now, that's the ones that you see in the greenhouse that have the long, they're growing up trellises, and they'll like go the whole length of the greenhouse. And they do that, and they cut all the leaves, and they just have like just the fruit. And I did that in my greenhouse last year. I had the indeterminate varieties in my greenhouse growing, and it was great. It worked really great. I'm out of pots to fill some little ones. I ran out. I've grown way more tomatoes this year than I did last year, so time to switch to the other pots. What was I saying? Oh, I'm gonna use organic. I try to do organic as much as possible. I was interrupted by my own thoughts there. So one of the things that you have to be mindful of is the type of the determinate or indeterminate. So I'm growing the determinate. What that means is it's determined of how big it's going to be. It's not going to get beyond a specific spec of that plant. It's only going to get yay big, and that's it. And it goes, it's more, usually those ones can be quite preferred for those in northern climates because it has one big harvest. Whereas the indeterminates, they just keep going and going and going, so your harvest is extended for a very long season. Whereas determinate varieties, if you're in the colder climates like in northern Alberta where I am, determinate varieties can be better for large batches of canning and those kind of things. Usually, it depends. I really like the beefsteak one or the Beaver Lodge, because it's kind of like a beefsteak. So it's meaty and it grows really fast, but also I can use it for sauces and stuff. It's not too watery. It's a really nice tomato for me, for what I do for canning and such. So that's important to me as well, as a grower and a canner and someone who's food farming for my family for the entire year, right? So that's something that I consider, and if you're getting into this, that you may want to consider as well. The other thing to consider if you are just starting out with gardening, I have a greenhouse. If you don't, you could always put in a hoop house or something. I would still not put your plants out too early. So there's that. But if you are in an area like I am, I do have to consider that I'm growing two varieties of tomatoes, determinate and indeterminate. So I have to be cautioned when I'm growing like that, because the determinate variety, it's gonna come in to season and it's gonna like grow and it's gonna grow really fast, and then it's going to have a very big flush of fruit. And then I have to be prepared to deal with that. So if you're a gardener and you're growing, 25 or 50 tomato plants that are determinate tomato varieties, you better be prepared when they're ready. And you're not gonna know when it's ready. The tomato will not be kind and say, I'm gonna be ready on this day so you can take some time off work. They don't do that. They will be ready when they darn well wanna be ready, and you're just gonna have to work around them. So that is something to consider with what type of tomato you're growing. If you're wanting to have a good production, a large production, and be able to get it done in one shot, then I would really look at the determinate variety. However, you better be ready. And if you're wanting something that is just pick away at it after work, if you're doing some canning, trying to fill your pantry with some canned tomatoes or tomato sauce or even pizza sauce or anything like that, you might want to plant 35 or 40 indeterminate, and that'll give you a big production for a very long duration of season, and you'll be able to make a canner full of pasta sauce after work a couple days a week, easy, or pop Ziploc bags full of tomatoes in the freezer and deal with them later. So there's those kind of considerations of the type. Those were things that I had to consider when I was in full swing of canning cucumbers. I was canning tomatoes because my determinate varieties were booming with tomatoes. So, there's that to consider. Timing, when you want your tomatoes to be, when do you want to be dealing with it? Do you want to just take a week of, have your canner out for that 1 week and just do it all? Pickles and canned tomatoes, because that's usually what happens. So salsa comes later in the fall usually. So with the indeterminate variety, it's kind of nice to have those and the determinants, because then you have a big flush to get your big batch process done, and then you can pick away at salsas as your peppers come into season, and the onions and garlic and everything else comes into season as well. So it's just timing and planning. It's what is your intention with your crop, and if it's just for eating, you might want to just pick something that's easy, like cherry tomatoes, something that's easy and quick to put on salads, those kind of things. And usually those are, they're a determinate variety, so they have like they're smaller, but there are indeterminate varieties of cherry tomatoes and such. So or they're semi-determinate. So there's just so many types. Know what it is. Know what space you have and what's your intention. What do you want to accomplish? What do you want to accomplish with your crop? So those are things to consider, that I consider as a gardener. And I had put a lot of intention in my first gardens. This year I am growing enough food for my family for the entire year. I actually used my last jar of pasta sauce, and I'm thinking, I should have made like 25 more jars of that, because I have a long time to go before we get to my, I'm gonna pull these little guys off. It's gonna be a long time before we get to tomato season here at in our zone 2. So there's that to consider. For growing, as far as growing tomatoes, something to really be aware of is that I find it's a good practice to have a good, strong, healthy plant. Like this plant, it looks pretty healthy, right? This is one of the ones that looks sickly in the seed starting tray, and I just cleaned it up and it'll be just fine. Its leaves are still a little purple on the bottom, but I do know that this bone meal that I put in there is definitely going to do the trick. And if it doesn't, well, we'll just have to nourish it a little bit more. But it looks great. I definitely always recommend, because I'm going to pot these things up a few more times. So these little plants are probably, they probably will go into another size cup, or like a one size up in can. I just don't have the space right now, so that's why they're going into these. but they will go into another size up of a can, which is not really efficient, but it's what I have to work with because my other size didn't come in and I don't have space. So for right now, they're gonna go into this size from the seedling tray. So I started them in the seedling tray and then I'm moving them up into this 3-inch pot. And from the, this 3-inch pot, I try to bury, I'm trying to create as much root system because remember, those little fuzzy things, they create roots. So as you can see, I have a lot of the plant, like the root is on the bottom of the pot, which it will kind of get a little bit root bound likely. I take off these leaves and then I bury it as deep as I can so it establishes new roots all the way along the stem. I want a really healthy stem system. When I plant these again, if they go into the ground, I'm going to plant them right up to the next, to the side of the leaves. So, I mean, I could plant them like that deep into, that deep into the ground if I wanted to. It's good for them because then it helps them establish a good root system and get as much nutrients. Tomatoes are very heavy feeders. That's the other thing. They need really nutritious soil, but they don't like being watered down. They don't like being saturated. So that's what the hardest part about growing tomatoes is, that sweet spot. It's learning how to get them happy, make sure they're nourished and they have enough nutrition, but they're not sitting in really moist, dense, thick soil. They don't like to be saturated. They don't like wet feet. So what I like to do if I'm growing in a garden, like in the garden beds, like my raised beds, I do put a little bit of seed starting mix, which has peat moss and stuff in it to lighten it up, with my compost and whatever organic soil I have in there. And it just kind of makes it so that moisture comes in and it'll absorb moisture, but it doesn't stay stuck and it still stays like nice and fluffy. So there's lots of air coming into those roots. And I also mulch. I mulch around my tomato plants when they're in the raised beds. Now, I don't know what other people do. I had really good success doing it that way with my tomatoes, specifically my determinate tomatoes. I don't know about the indeterminates. The indeterminates I grew in, I put some out into my garden on a trellis and they did okay. They were planted late, so they got a frost before they could really produce a lot, but they did pretty well considering they were planted late. But the ones in the greenhouse, they just kept growing and growing and growing and getting bigger, and so they had a really good root system in there because I have raised beds in my greenhouse as well, and they did well. But the same thing, the soil had lots of air, and I didn't mulch in there, but they weren't saturated because the beds themselves have really great drainage. Actually, I have branches inside of the raised beds. We put branches down before we put soil in there, so there's lots of air movement inside the raised beds in my greenhouse. So they were very happy. I had a couple issues with blossom end rot, which was, there's so many reasons why you could have blossom end rot. One of the things I should mention about putting starting mix into your garden soil when you're planting tomatoes, I just did that because I had it on hand, and I don't recommend doing that. Anyone should probably not do that because it is sterile soil and it doesn't really have any nutrition. I was just using it as kind of like for making the soil, like for amending the soil for what I felt I needed for my tomatoes in that specific bed based on the soil I had. So this year I will put more organic matter in there and more like compost and whatnot and amend it that way. But the reason I did that is because in those beds, I am watering more frequently with fertilizing them. I'm giving them lots of food and nutrition. So if you are mixing in stuff that is like peaty, like peat moss, stuff like that into your beds or into your soil to kind of lift it and give it some aeration, you really do have to feed them more frequently because there isn't as much nutrition in that type of soil. So it is a little bit of a delicate dance. Once you figure it out, it's easy peasy. Tomatoes are really easy to grow. It's just, we think they're so hard to grow, but they're not. They're not. If I can grow a tomato, you can grow a tomato. I guarantee you. So a couple of other things to consider when you are considering, you know, how many tomato plants or what varieties you're planning to grow. Knowing, like, you never want to spend more on your seed starting stuff and growing it than what you're actually going to be saving or like what it's worth. So for us, where we live in northern Alberta, you know, we don't go to a lot of like the Walmart or anything that very frequently because we don't have one really near us. It's about an hour away. And even so, I really like to stick with organic food. And so organic food where we live comes with a hefty price tag. So if you're like us, you know, and want to have organic food and know where your food comes from, then growing your own food like tomatoes to make your products such as ketchup or pasta sauce or salsa, it's a very smart choice, right? Because you know where it's coming from and you have control what's in your food, and it is cost efficient if you're doing it efficiently. So an example, I know how many plants I need. I would say for a family of two or three, 30 tomato plants in a year is probably plenty for doing canning and such, depending on what you're making. For us, I'm planting this year probably close to 90 tomato plants, 90 to 100 tomato plants this year. But I'm also doing that because I'm making pasta sauce, I'm making pizza sauce, I'm doing things like salsa, where those things are something we eat quite readily. Hot sauce as something, or like some hot sauces that I have, I do put tomatoes in them, but for the most part, what I'm going to be making is basically tomato products such as salsa and pasta sauce. So let's just talk about salsa and pasta sauce for a second. For us to go to IGA, which is our only grocery store in town that we live in, or in the nearest town to where we live, the pasta sauce that we would buy is usually around $5 a jar. And that's pretty conservative. Sometimes it's $7, sometimes it's $5. The one that we like, the one that tastes the best, that we will actually eat and enjoy, is about $5 per jar. Now, if we were to eat pasta twice a week, which my family could very easily eat pasta 2 times a week, or some sort of a dish with pasta sauce in it, conservatively, I would say we would use pasta sauce in some sort of cooking twice a week. So, there's 52 weeks in a year. Ouch. There's 52 weeks in a year, and if we are consuming 2 jars of pasta sauce per week, I mean, that is $520 worth of pasta sauce. So the fact is that I paid $18 for these containers for the kit of 110 with the labels, and the soil was very inexpensive, and I'm going to have to pot them up again into another set of pots. It is cost efficient for me to put the time into it and to actually do that because of the whole, expanded total of savings that we're going to have by growing our own tomatoes to make our own pasta sauce in the exchange of dollar to dollar of what we are actually consuming to what we can actually do ourselves. So it's efficient for me to grow 90 or 100 tomatoes and have to pot them up throughout the season because I make so many different things. I mean, that's just pasta sauce. $520 a year in pasta sauce is, you know, that's just one thing. There's also ketchup. Well, we go through a bottle of ketchup probably every 2 months. You know, that's another savings there. Just salsa alone, we would spend on a typical year $620, approximate $620 per year on just salsa. So between tomato sauce or tomato sauce for making, you know, soups, or like tomato soup, or, you know, making pasta sauce or salsa, you know, we save a lot of money by growing 100 plants that I have to put this work into. I dedicate a couple weekends of the year to do this maintenance on growing up my own seedlings. And, you know, the cost per what we're saving is definitely worth it for us and our family, in my perception. Plus, it's organic, and I know what we are consuming because I have control of what I make. When it comes to gardening and seed starting and such, like doing your own tomatoes, the initial cost of things, you only have an upfront cost, because, you know, if you're growing a specific variety, you know, as long as you're not growing like hybrids, and if you're growing heirlooms, you can save the seeds. And so year after year, you can save your seeds from the previous year and use all of your same containers or seed starting trays, your same grow lights, your same shelving. You don't have any extra cost. It's just the initial cost of getting started that you have year after year. Unless you're wanting to do different varieties or something happens to your seeds, you really don't have a lot of cost after you initially get yourself started, other than soil amendments, fertilizers, compost, those kind of things, which if you live on an acreage or on a farm, you can create your own. Even if you live in town and you have chickens, you can create your own compost. Or if you live in town and you have, you know, a compost for your garden scraps or anything like that, you can be very efficient in how much you actually spend on your garden. So every year after your initial setup, you know, unless you're growing more and more and you need more trays, which I do, guilty, your costs are always going to, your cost of growing your produce the year after of equivalency to what you've done the previous year, it's just going to be a wash, because there really isn't a cost if you are saving your own seeds. It all works out in the end, because you can reuse your materials that you've initially purchased, unless they get damaged, which happens. So a lot of these are dry. They're yellowing because they're dry, and they're under stress because they're dry. I noticed some of these cells, the shape of these cells, they're called the hex, oh goodness, hex cells. I can't remember what they're called. I'll post it here. They have a really funny way of drying out the seedlings themselves. See? So the dirt is kind of staying in there, and it's not really good for this size of plant. I should have took them out of there, but it's just dry. They're not getting water from the bottom water, and it's not sufficient enough from what I was watering them from on top, and that's what's going on with my plants. So always check your cells. That's why they're turning yellow, is because they're dry. So we've had a mixed bag. Some got too wet and some got too dry, and that's what's happening with my tomatoes. And problem solved. So we'll give them a little boost and make them healthy. So just to recap, we potted up the tomatoes. The yellow and the purpling leaves were probably for two reasons. One, I discovered that I had underwatered and overwatered. Now, how that happened was some of the cells in these new trays that I was using, or tray cells, or whatever you want to call them, the hex cells that I tried out this year, I guess I must have got a little bit in a hurry and I made a very big mistake by not making sure that the soil was all the way to the bottom in some of the cells. And also, I found that some of the soil wasn't getting saturated. So I think what was happening is the bottom part of the cell was like like crinkled. And so it wasn't reaching the bottom of the tray, even though that the plants looked healthy, the roots were growing down into the water tray. They just weren't getting saturated in the soil and competing too much. So, you know, when they're not getting water, even when I did fertilize and spritz them on the leaves, they were just getting that as nutrition and they weren't getting any nutrition from the water that I was feeding fertilized water in while they were in the seed starting mix. So they were just stressed. They were stressed and they had a phosphorus deficiency. So some of the plants were getting overwatered because I was compensating for the ones that looked like they were underwatered. And then so it was just like, it was just one of those things where you have to just check. And the only way to really check is to go through them plant by plant, as I did when I up potted them. So sometimes you just have to do that. And everyone makes mistakes. I clearly made a mistake and I corrected it. So they actually looked really nice. I took off all of the baby or most of the baby leaves, the ones that were yellowing. And so I took off most of the baby leaves and I think they will, yeah, she will definitely try to go and play in the dirt. I think they'll be fine. I gave them some water, some really, really light, mild drink of fertilizer when I watered them in. I'm gonna spritz them with some very light, like a couple little granules of fertilizer in the water bottle, and I'm just gonna lightly give them a little mist to kind of knock the dust off of them and let them rest tonight. I typically would have a fan going so that they have nice strong stems. I'm gonna not turn the fan on tonight. I'm just gonna let them all rest. And tomorrow, I think they'll be great to turn the fan on and start, you know, treating them as I normally would, normal water routine. They'll perk right up. So I have those ones done. I still have a whole bunch more to do. I'm not even close to being done yet. So, but I thought they looked super cute, all in their little baby cans. I'm interested in knowing what the indigo rose, I guess the best way to describe their flavor is smoky. So, because they're a black tomato or a black shouldered tomato, purpley black. So I'm excited to see what that's going to be like because I think they'd be really good in salsa. A smoky tasting tomato in salsa. Yes, please. So I hope you learned something and you enjoyed. If you're wanting to see the progress of my garden, I am going to be vlogging the progress, the troubleshooting, all the things that go along with it. This year I'm putting in a cut flower, so I'm officially becoming a flower farmer this year, and we are producing enough food for our family for the year. And I'm going to be harvesting and growing and harvesting and preserving and canning and freeze drying. So if you're interested in staying along for the journey and checking out what I'm doing and learning from my mistakes, please be sure to subscribe. I would love to have you here with me on my channel. And if you have any tips or advice that I missed, please be sure to comment below and let me know what your experiences are with seed starting, and if these kind of experiences have ever happened to you, pro or not, rookie mistakes or not. We all make mistakes, and we just got to know how to troubleshoot. So I hope my mistakes helped you learn so you don't screw up too. Much love. Thanks for being here. Take care.